Hello again, and welcome back to this special retreat on learning to live permanently in the presence of God. Today we're going to talk about temptation because it is something that all of us struggle with, usually trying to use our own willpower to overcome it. But when we practice the presence of God, we get some rather unique methods to resist temptation that are far more effective while also being a whole lot easier to do. We're going to begin by looking at a couple of things that Brother Lawrence has said. And as we reflect upon this, I will show you how to meditate upon the things that he says. A lot of it is very profound, but it's not very easy to understand. The trick is to go slowly. First, figuring out what he's saying, then trying to resolve the conflict because a lot of what he says goes contrary to what we've learned, and finally seeing how we can integrate it into our lives. This is what Lawrence writes. The first benefit that the soul receives from the practice of the presence of God is that its faith becomes more intense and efficacious in all life situations, and especially in times of need, since it easily obtains graces in moments of temptation and in the inevitable dealings with creatures. Let me explain. We all get tempted. We will always be tempted, and very often we succumb to temptation. But why? We don't need to give in. In his letter to the Corinthians, Paul writes, "No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it." This is one verse, but there are three elements to it. One, no temptation has seized us except what is common to man. Two, God is faithful and He won't let us be tempted beyond what we can bear. And three, should we not be able to withstand the assault, God promises a way out. Let us look at each of these in turn because they are very important factors in fighting temptation. One, much as we may want to believe that the temptations we face are stronger than what others face, they aren't. Others are tempted just as we are, and many of them resist these temptations, don't they? So if they can, why can't we? Let us consider the temptations that Jesus went through. Whenever we think of Jesus being tempted, we think of the temptations He faced in the desert. The gospel writers narrate this in such a sterile manner, we don't get a sense of the battle that went out there between Jesus and the devil. It would have been brutal. And it definitely wasn't the only time Jesus was tempted. He would have been tempted from the time he was a little boy right up until his death on the cross. When people mocked Him, when they walked away from Him, when they tried to kill Him, this happened several times before they actually did. He would surely have been tempted to give up His mission. The devil would have taunted Him constantly and continuously. You really want to die for these guys? Look at how they behave. Look at how they treat you. But He withstood this temptation and all the others, didn't He? You might say, but He was God. Yes, but when He walked upon this earth, He did so as a human too, just like one of us. And if He could resist temptation, then so can we, because we have His Spirit within us, don't we? The second thing Paul tells us is that we have God's assurance that we will never be tempted more than we can bear. We can take tremendous hope and courage from this assurance, knowing that when we face temptation, God is permitting it because He believes that we can withstand it. And we just need to show Him that He is right. 3, there are times when no matter what we do, we know we are going under. Well, even at moments like these, God has provided a way out. But to find this way out, we need to drop to our knees and turn to God in prayer. Unfortunately, the hardest thing to do, as you probably will know, the hardest thing to do at times like this is to turn to God in prayer and we give in. But why? Why do we give in despite everything Paul says? Why do we succumb so easily? Again, the reason is because we are not in the presence of God at all times. If we were, we would find all these three things that Paul talks about so easy to do. One, we would resist temptation far more easily than we do now because we have made everything we do or don't do for the love of Jesus. So temptation means sin. Sin means offending God. So because we love God so much, we don't want to offend Him. When we're tempted, we say, hey, I'm not going to do this and hurt my God, so devil, you can take a hike. 2, our trust in God's will would have increased to the point where we wouldn't let anything daunt us because we know for a fact that God is faithful to His word. So when He says we will not be tempted more than we can bear, we would just know that this is true. At this moment in time, as we are right now, we might say it, but we don't really believe it. But experiential knowledge is different from head knowledge. And when we have an experience of God, everything changes. And 3, to find the way out, all we need to do is to kind of turn to God because He's right there with us. I mean, come on. We are in His presence continuously. So grace flows the instant we need it. We don't even really need to ask Him, although we do need to turn towards Him and pay attention so the grace doesn't slip us by. Again, this is a process, but let me illustrate how this works practically. Let me talk about something that many of us struggle with, anger. Do you get angry? I thought so. Thus far, those of us who have been bothered by it have tried to rein in our anger, usually using our own willpower to do so. But willpower is like a bad battery. It doesn't work very well and it doesn't last too long. But when we cultivate the practice of the presence of God, this is what happens. We first turn to God, asking for the grace not to lose our temper, because without Him, nothing is possible. We then tell Him we really need His help because we cannot keep our anger in check without His assistance. So, now let's assume we're good for a couple of hours. We haven't got angry, but then we suddenly have a mini eruption. Your wife overcooked the rice perhaps, and instead of being a nice guy and acting like it's no big deal, you kick up a fuss. It's been known to happen. But this time, because you're trying to become a decent human being, you feel bad. So what do? Sink into self-pity? No. We follow principles we have established earlier. We don't get discouraged. We don't beat ourselves up. We simply turn straight to God and we tell Him that we're sorry that we left His presence. We apologize to Him for losing our cool. I'd apologize to the wife too. We remind Him that we can't do this without His help, and then we stick even closer to Him, determined not to leave His presence again. And you will notice that in a few days things start to change. Let me give you a personal example. These things make more sense when you know how they actually work. When I was based in Dubai, I'm living in Mumbai now, my wife and I lived in a house that had a garage, but it could accommodate only one car. Both of us had cars, which meant that when one of us parked a car inside, the other had to park it outside. This, of course, blocked the exit for the car parked inside. Now, because I got home from work before she did, I'd parked my car invariably inside. However, I also left for work before she did, which meant that she had to move her car out of the way for me to move mine. One day, she couldn't find her keys. I was late for a meeting and started getting impatient, then annoyed. Now, this was a trigger for an anger outburst. But since I was practicing the presence of God, I forced my attention towards Him, and He said, yo, take it easy. You can't do anything until she moves the car, yes? She can't move it until she finds the key, yes? So if you don't want to help her find the keys, why don't you talk to me until she does? And good thing I did, because it took her 15 minutes to find her keys. But do you see how a potentially explosive situation was diffused? Eventually, as Lawrence says, for the soul accustomed to the practice of faith by this exercise sees and senses God present by a simple remembrance. Simply put, we have become so accustomed to the presence of God that we just need to remember Him, to have Him right there with us. Then Lawrence continues, it calls out to Him easily and effectively, thus obtaining what it needs. And voila, it's instantly done. It is really amazing, and you will see the difference the practice of the presence of God makes in your life once it's become a habit. At this point, I would like to inject a small note of caution. This is a foolproof method of living a holy life, provided you remain in the presence of God and turn towards Him in moments of need. I often think of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. God walked in the garden with them, and they knew Him so well. If anyone truly lived in the perpetual presence of God, it was Adam and Eve. Yet they strayed away from Him towards something that had been expressly forbidden. And then, when faced with the temptation that was bound to follow, they could have turned to God and called out to Him. He was right there, remember, but they chose not to. And then, instead of going to Him and trying to make amends, they tried to hide themselves. And this leads us to another lesson. Don't hide. Listen to Lawrence, and if some of this sounds decidedly strange, it is only because we have never heard anything like this before. We have read this before, and it should make more sense now. Listen. The holiest, most ordinary, and most necessary practice of the spiritual life is that of the presence of God. It is to take delight in and become accustomed to His divine company, speaking humbly and conversing lovingly with Him all the time, at every moment, without rule or measure, especially, listen to this carefully, especially in times of temptation, suffering, aridity, weariness, even infidelity and sin. Wow. Converse with God, especially in times of temptation, even infidelity and sin. Really, this goes against every natural instinct. When we are tempted, we want to run away from God, right? Because there is a part of us that wants to give in to temptation. Then when we're indulging in the sin, we most certainly don't want God spectating. So we pretend that He can't see us, even though He sees everything. And finally, when we have sinned, we feel guilty and ashamed and try to hide from God like our famous ancestors did. Lawrence tells us to do the opposite, but to converse with God in the middle of the sin. Isn't that crazy? Not really, and let me tell you why. Consider yourself. If you're putting all the things that we've learned about in the last few sessions into practice, you're doing so because you want to come closer to God, right? Even if it feels right now that He's a million light years away. Think for a moment about how much God appreciates that. Now, our Lord knows we struggle with temptation, and He knows pretty much what that feels like because He went through it Himself. This is what the author of the letter to the Hebrews says. We do not have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin. So our Lord understands, and He is sympathetic, and if we talk to Him, He will help us. As we saw in the personal example I gave earlier, He guided me through the situation. But He can't do that if we shut Him out, see? Now let us imagine for a moment that instead of listening to God, I went and started blasting my wife, as I've been known to do in the past. Wouldn't it be wise to keep conversing with God in the middle of the shouting instead of cutting Him off again? There is a good chance He will still talk some sense into me. But let us imagine that I just couldn't or wouldn't listen and totally lost it. I mean, I really blew my temper. The entire situation has moved from bad to worse, is at risk of deteriorating into something terrible. So wouldn't it be prudent to still keep conversing with God? When we see the logic of it, we understand that what we have been doing has not really worked very well for us, but this can, and it does. And about a year or two into this routine, something else starts to happen. Our will starts to get subordinate to the will of God. Now listen to what Lawrence says. Since the will is always with God, who is a consuming fire, this fire reduces to ashes all that is opposed to it. The soul thus inflamed can live only in the presence of its God, a presence that produces in its heart a holy ardor, a sacred zeal, and a strong desire to see this God loved, known, served, and adored by all creatures. In his letter to the Romans, Paul advises us to hate what is evil and cling to what is good. This happens automatically when the will is always with God, because God himself, who is an all-consuming fire, would destroy any opposition to him. See Deuteronomy 9:3. And when there is nothing within us that stands opposed to God, we start becoming holy people. Whoever said it was hard. For your exercise today, I want you to reflect upon the things Brother Lawrence said, especially Spiritual Maxim 6. I just read it out to you, and here it is again. The holiest, most ordinary, and most necessary practice of the spiritual life is that of the presence of God. It is to take delight in and become accustomed to his divine company, speaking humbly and conversing lovingly with him all the time, at every moment, without rule or measure, especially in times of temptation, suffering, aridity, weariness, even infidelity and sin. Before I end, here is a song that you might want to listen to. It is a song of pure grace and is one of my favorites. It's called Power of Your Love and was written and composed by Jeff Bullock of Hillsong Church. It tells of how the power of God's love transforms our lives. You will find a link in the description box below. In our next session, we will speak about thought control. Until then, be God's. God bless you.